Okay, hello everybody, and good evening. I think we'll make a start. We'll allow a little bit of time for people to find us following the shuffle of venues, but it's like we're now a couple of minutes late, a couple of minutes over to give people that time, so let's commence. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we work and we speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and paying our respects to their elders, past and present. Welcome to you all. It's wonderful to see such a turnout. My name is Rebecca Burden. I'm the Managing Director of the Energy Transition Hub, which is an amazing initiative that's been operating now since 2017. It's a collaborative venture between 12 research institutes, 6 in Australia and 6 in Germany. And we are hosting this seminar this evening. This seminar is part of a series that's sponsored by the Victorian Clean Technology Fund, which is a fund that invests in and assists with the commercialisation of clean technologies in Victoria. It's great to have them as a partner in this series, and we hope to see lots of you again. But I have to say, hydrogen is one of the topics of the moment. We had originally conceived of this as quite a small affair at our hub premises in Readiness Street, and as the numbers continue to climb, we thought, we can probably allow some more people to attend or find a larger venue, and then that venue seems to be far exceeding its capacity, so it's sold out very quickly, so we moved to a larger venue. So welcome to our fireside chat, that was originally intended to be a small in-house thing. It's very good to see all this interest. I think that it is fair to say there's a great deal of interest in Australia. There were a number of reports produced during the course of 2018 that highlighted prospects for hydrogen in Australia, and one of our speakers will talk about a bit more this evening. It's not just in Australia at the moment. There is a great deal of focus on this around the world. I think some of the international reports have added to the hydrogen party in Australia, the International Energy Agency, as well as Energy Outlook in 2018 at the end of the year, November, highlighted that it thought Australia could potentially be one of the largest providers of hydrogen from electrolysis paired with wind and solar. And there is, as a result of all of that, a great deal of interest in hydrogen in Australia. And I think, in contrast with some other areas, there's a great deal of political will to drive this forward. There's a joint ministerial statement coming out of Coaling in December that said they have a vision for Australia to be a leading, to make Australia a major player in the global hydrogen economy by 2030. And there's a hydrogen strategy task force being chaired by Dr. Alan Finkel that's producing a report on how to realise that, and we're planning to do that by the end of this year. So there's a lot going on, and research institutes like ourselves are expanding our program in this area. We have a suite of global and Australian models that are looking to expand to include hydrogen as part of their energy system modelling, and I think there's a number of places around Australia doing similar things. Having said that, there are a host of questions, notwithstanding all the excitement, there are a host of questions that need to be addressed in relation to how this hydrogen economy may emerge, both in the sense of the demand and what may pan out from major sources, potential sources of demand like Japan, and on the supply side as well, including what proportion may come from thermochemical processes as opposed to electrochemical processes, and the thermochemical being processes which are based on fossil fuels paired with carbon capture and storage, and electrochemical being functionally around electrolysis paired with low or zero emissions technologies. And there's a lot of work to be done to determine what proportion might come from each of those. We have one of the world's first projects to look at thermochemical hydrogen production from brown coal in the Latrobe Valley, which will be one of the subjects that's spoken about tonight. And there's a lot of work to be done, and that demonstration project highlights how much is to be done to bring costs to a commercial level. It's been reported it as costing in the order of $500 million for and taking 160 tonnes of brown coal to produce 3 tonnes of hydrogen. But it's regarded as, by CSIRO, for example, as one of the most likely thermal projects in Australia. The IEA was talking really about electrochemical processes, and it really sees a vast potential for Australia to be a big supplier in the global hydrogen economy. So we have 3 speakers tonight who will give us great deal insight into some of these issues. We've got joining us from Tohoku University in Japan, Associate Professor Gregory. He's with the graduate school of environmental studies there and focuses on energy technologies, including both coal and hydrogen. We also have 2 short responders to Greg's seminar. He's the primary speaker, but we have with us Dr. Graham Palmer, who's a consultant and researcher at the Energy Transition Hub. He has a background in engineering and researches across a range of renewable energy technologies, energy and economic modelling, and looks a lot at the moment at the role of energy storage, including hydrogen. So Graham will give a short response on how the hydrogen supply projects are panning out across Australia. We also have Professor Leo. Now, Leo has a wonderful story. When I asked him how to pronounce it, he just said Leo G. So I'm going to stop there. He's the co-director of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute's Smart Specialisation Project in Gippsland, which is sponsored through the Latrobe Valley Authority. And he'll give a short response around some of the Latrobe Valley specific transition issues. Without taking up any more time, I'll pass you over to Greg.
Good evening, everybody. I think you can all hear me. Is that okay? Sure. Yep. So, thank you so much for coming here today. I'm just going to put down my iPhone. This is the timer here. So, yeah, thank you all for taking up sort of your precious time to come and hear this talk and engage in this conversation. So, I'm really excited to. I should go to my title slide. So, yeah, today's title, as we all know, is focusing on things from the Japanese perspective, Japan's transition. And so I've obviously put a few nice keywords in that title that have caught some attention here in Australia. So I think maybe the role of Australian brown coal and renewables might have sort of, I think has the potential to appeal to a very wide audience, which might explain why we have so many seats occupied in this room today. I'm actually Australian. I'm born in Melbourne, actually, but I've sort of left for greener pastures many years ago, doing the opposite to what some of the world's great researchers are doing now, coming to Australia. And it's a very nice experience to come home and see so many people in the room. I feel like the prodigal son returning home. This is a nicer welcome that I get in my own house in the Yarra Valley when I go home. So I've just using this time in Australia. I went and visited the Latrobe Valley yesterday and had a few conversations down there. So I'm not going to spend most of my talk talking about the Victorian brown coal perspective, which I will tackle, of course, at the end. I'm going to focus mainly on the Japanese perspective today. So this is just a quick outline of my talk. So I just wasn't sure of how many people know, like, I guess, the versatility or the importance of hydrogen. So I've got one slide. If you had to sort of talk to, I don't know how many people in there, maybe 200. If you had to sort of talk to 200 people and use, say, 3 minutes to talk about hydrogen, what would you do? So I wasn't sure what to do, so I stole a slide off my great colleague here, Dr. Graham Palmer, who came to Japan, to my university, last week and gave a presentation about hydrogen. So we're going to start off with that, and then we're going to jump into sort of a little bit of the policy aspects in Japan to understand how they make their energy policy and to look at hydrogen from that perspective. And then we're going to sort of focus upon fuel cell vehicles, because I think many people, when we look at hydrogen utilization, really focusing there, and some of the challenges that are encountered in trying to diffuse these, and then looking at international supply chains, which is obviously where the Latrobe Valley project fits in. So let's get started. So the first slide, I'm sorry, and I'm just going to ask if it's possible for the engineer to maybe look at dimming the front lights if that's possible. I should have asked this earlier, just so the slides can come across a little bit nicer. Thank you, I'm sorry. So the first slide we have here is just an overview of hydrogen. And what we have here on the left is a whole bunch of different ways we can sort of create hydrogen. So we can see that we can use electricity, and then we can feed that into a machine that sort of will split the oxygen from the hydrogen atom in water. So we'd have an input of water here, and we're going to use electricity to break that chemical bond. And then we would create pure hydrogen, which we can sort of, you know, it's a storage, it's a carrier for energy, and we can store that. And then we can use that in a whole variety of interesting places. The first thing that comes to most people's minds is actually mobility, and it's actually not just vehicles. It's everything from buses, trucks, forklifts, trains, and potentially in the future, even though I'm not aware of any prototypes for this right now, airplanes and ships. So you probably notice that these guys are the ones that really would travel long distances. That would be very difficult to power with batteries. So we have a big interesting application area for hydrogen already here, but not only is it sort of looking at it in transport, but also hydrogen, we can burn it. And so we can get heat created, and we can also put it into fuel cells. So for example, by putting it into fuel cells, we're going to create electricity, which can go back into the grid, but we can get heat as an output, and heat can be used for heating, for example. But we can also burn hydrogen directly, for example, in the steel manufacturing industry. And that's really important because we know that we have renewables today to replace fossil fuels in the electricity sector. But to replace coking coal in the steel production sector, that's a real challenge. And so hydrogen has potential there. And so we can use renewable energy to create hydrogen fuel electrolysis, but we can also use fossil fuels, either coal or oil or gas as well. And we can use chemical processes to also create hydrogen. So the interesting thing about hydrogen is that it's very versatile, it can come from many, many resources, and I think most people are aware of that. And also, the gas can also come from biomass, for example, from sewage sludge, or from animal manure, animal urine, for example. So this graph is telling us lots of different things, but one thing is a country that has lots of these resources, renewable energy resources, potentially has the potential to make lots of hydrogen, and that would be Australia. And on the other hand, it's telling us that countries with lots of fossil fuel resources will also have the potential to create lots of hydrogen, which is also Australia. And then from another perspective, it says that countries that have lots of mobility or lots of stimulus, for example, have potential markets, a big demand for hydrogen. That would be Asia, that would be Japan, and that would also especially be China. So this is a little bit of a crash course in hydrogen, but this is a really ongoing project. There's no sort of single way we should be looking at how to create hydrogen, how to use it. This is an ongoing conversation. And there are a lot of countries taking an interest in this topic now. So Japan is one of them, but also Germany is a big one that's really looking at renewables production for hydrogen, and China has also come on board recently. So that's the crash course in hydrogen over. So let's jump now into the discussion of Japanese energy policy. So the first thing to know about Japan, energy policy in Japan, is it's very centralized and it's very top down. And so the people that make the energy policy, it's not the Ministry of Environment, it's the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. So these are the people, their foremost interest is to further the development of Japanese industry. And so these are the government bureaucrats, and they operate basically at an arm's length from the Prime Minister. So if the Prime Minister changes in Japan, which it frequently does, that doesn't mean that energy policy gets reversed and has to start from zero again. There's a remarkable amount of continuity in Japan regarding the way the narratives and the actual direction of energy policy. And so because it survived some changes, Prime Minister, it's able to be very sort of continuous. And we also have a very distinctly pro-coal and pro-nuclear flavor to the energy policy in Japan. And there are many reasons for that, but that's just how it is for now without making a judgment on that. And also, it's also this policy-making environment that is the bureaucrats are sort of running the show and then giving their energy policy to the Prime Minister or the Cabinet, who will typically stamp that. Rarely would there be intervention from a Prime Minister coming in saying, I'm going to, for example, like in many countries, I'm going to, bring about an emissions, greenhouse gas emissions cut by 50% by the year X. And you are going to make a policy to reflect that. It's not really how it works in Japan. And so also the METI has quite very strong relationship with utility and with heavy industry. And so that's being blamed for the retard or the delay in widespread renewable diffusion in Japan. And so climate policy in Japan, which you could sort of interpret as political ambition. For example, a Prime Minister coming along saying we're going to cut our emissions by X% in year X. That sort of political ambition is actually shaped by is sort of overcome by sort of economic feasibility concerns. And so the way energy policy works in Japan is basically METI would assemble panels or expert committees of people from industry and also academic experts and asked them to sort of look at each sector, for example, steel making, automobile manufacturing, cement making, and asked them, how much energy do you think you'll use? And to answer that question, I would say, how many tons of cement, or sorry, how many tons of steel would you make in the future? And so this is a very bottom-up calculation process. And this bottom-up calculation process, that's all aggregated to then produce the greenhouse gas emissions and the energy sort of forecast, the energy demand forecast in Japan. And so this process right now has led to a target for the Paris Agreement of minus 26 by 2030 and minus 80% by 2050. And actually, the base year is this guy here. We have this sort of spike here, 2013, and it hits like that the year that had the highest greenhouse gas emissions for their reference here. And why do we have a spike here? And we all know that's because Fukushima caused this terrible accident in 2011, and all the 25% of Japan's electricity, which was nuclear, was turned off overnight, and all of a sudden you had to replace that with fossil fuels, which experienced this big spike here. And so Japan's greenhouse gas emissions are not moving in the right direction. If you look at it per capita, actually we're up to about 9.6 tons, which is higher than the European right now. And this is actually going up, as you can see. And but the Japanese population, fortunately, or unfortunately, is declining. So without too much effort in Japan, you probably expect greenhouse gas, aggregate national greenhouse gas emissions coming down. But generally, Japan does not have a very good reputation abroad when it comes to climate ambition or for the direction of their energy mix. So the energy mix in Japan in 2010, we had this nice, zero carbon, 30% of Japanese electricity, and the installed capacity is about 113 gigawatts. And so coal was a poised part of that, 25%. But what's happened after Fukushima, all the nuclear got switched off. We've had an increase in coal, which explains the increase in the greenhouse gas emissions. And we've had a big increase in liquid natural gas. It's liquid gas, so it's very expensive to import in Japan. And what we have is we've had a big explosion in renewables, but that renewables is basically just solar in Japan. We have a big delay in our winds, even though Japan, like a lot of countries, has good wind potential. So the bottom-up decision-making environment in Japan regarding energy policy, this is the projected mix for 2030. And basically, we projected to have about, a pizza, 4 slices. One slice would be nuclear, and another slice would be coal, another slice would be LNG, the other slice would be renewables, and that would be mainly solar. And putting aside all judgments about is this a good or a bad idea, what we see in Japan is basically this risk hedging approach, where the idea is to never put all of your eggs in one basket. And that's shaped by historical experience, where during the 1970s, Japan twice suffered the so-called oil shocks, where their electricity generation was basically, I think it was almost 70, 80, 90% coming from oil. All of a sudden, they had difficulties importing oil into Japan. So they weren't able to create electricity. So that showed them the problem of depending on one particular region, which was the Middle East, and one particular fuel source, which was oil. So their strategy for energy is characterized by diversity. And with that, we can start thinking about hydrogen now. So this is, in a nutshell, this national roadmap, which I think you're probably often going to see many sort of recreated diagrams for in Japan. And this is a 3-phase kind of strategy. So let's start one by one. Even though I should point out that these are actually not to be proceeded one after the other. These are 3 strategies that are supposed to be achieved in parallel. So first of all, the idea is to work with existing technologies. That involves fuel cell vehicles, FCVs, and stationary fuel cells, which are these things here, which are basically fuel cells that are cogeneration. They create heat, which is typically converted to hot water, and they create electricity. And these are generally right now concentrated in the residential sector. So the idea is in phase 1 is to start with these existing technologies to get them out of the market, because by selling as many fuel cells as possible, that's obviously going to help drive down costs and build up economics of scale. And so, to get these guys out on the road, we also need to create fueling stations. And so on fueling stations, we have very concrete targets in place. We want to build 160 of these by the time that the Olympics come on. So in this diagram here, 2020 is kind of one of the first little milestones. And that's when the Olympics will be in Tokyo. And that's when Japan intends to showcase to the world its leadership in hydrogen. And so that's kind of the first stage. And while this is happening, the second stage is much more ambitious, and this involves R&D. And this is where the Latrobe Valley project would fit into all of this. So the idea is to start looking at creating lots of hydrogen from overseas resources and from making it, making mass-produced and from cheap resources. And the idea is that not only are we going to use these hydrogen, when we eventually move into the commercialization phase, which is one of the futures, kind of 2030, the idea is to use hydrogen not only in the mobility sector, but also in the power plant sector. In other words, the existing natural gas power plants today, to start introducing hydrogen into these, we can mix up to about 20–30% of hydrogen into the existing gas mixture. And in the future, we can actually transition entirely to hydrogen in the electricity generation sector. And the reason for doing that is because the electricity generation sector would consume far more hydrogen than the transport sector would. So, and this would create a synergy. This would create a demand for hydrogen, which would bring in large amounts of hydrogen at a cheap cost in Japan, and then the mobility sector would reap the benefits from this. So that's the general approach. And then in phase 3, the idea is to make sure that all this hydrogen is carbon-free, and that would involve, if you're working with fossil fuels, carbon capture and storage, the CCS. And then the idea is to move this hydrogen into not only forklifts, vehicles, and buses, as is the present focus, but into increasingly ships, trains, and completely replace natural gas generation in the power sector. So these are kind of like already started, these like research and development projects, and the Latrobe Valley, just to repeat myself, is part of this kind of phase 2 move, with the eye on moving into phase 3, where that Latrobe Valley core would have CCS and would deliver huge amounts of carbon to Japan. Now, there's some very specific targets, like diffusion targets, that are linked to this roadmap. And to concentrate just on mobility, for example, the idea is by the Olympics, by the time the Olympics are in town, to have 40,000 of these on the road. These are not annual targets, these are like cumulative sales. And just to put in perspective, there are currently 62 million vehicles, internal combustion engines in Japan, which is half the population basically. So basically, 1 out of every 2 people has a car. And the idea is to get 40,000 of these on the roads, and then move up to 200,000 by 2025, and then in the future to replace all internal combustion engines with either EVs or hydrogen. This is a very, very ambitious target. Toyota in their present Mirai is, I think my battery might die there. I'll keep talking until it dies again. But Toyota only has a very limited capacity. They're moving, I think, next year to be able to, I think, make about 3,000 per year. But to achieve this target of 40,000 vehicles on the roads, probably not going to be possible. It's probably overambitious. But what it's more realistic is actually to have, I'm sorry, don't you really hate it when you make a mistake in front of like 200 people in your slides? This target should read 160 by 2020. So I'm sorry, I'm looking at buses, aren't I? I'm sorry. So this is correct, yes. So buses are also a part of this. And buses obviously consume much more hydrogen than vehicles ever would. So these are already moving onto the roads. And the idea is, that, again, in the far future, to replace our current bus fleets. Forklifts is also a part of this, but fueling stations really is really key to all this. So without a fueling station, we can't have fuel cell vehicles, obviously, because they have to get their fuel from somewhere. So these are just targets. And on top of these diffusion targets, what we have also is this fixation on cost. And the idea is $10 a kilo for a kilo of hydrogen. We have to put 5 kilos of this into a vehicle. So into a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, that would cost 5 kilos, which would cost $50 US. And that's quite expensive. And the idea is to bring down these costs in the future. So there are very specific production cost targets as well, that are driving this. Now, to put this in perspective, these are very ambitious targets, but we have to think about something else in Japan, which is population. Japan, as you all know, is the world's most rapidly aging population. Right now, over 25% of the population is over 65. And if you went to Tokyo, you probably wouldn't have that impression because there are so many young people coming to Tokyo. But if you go to the rural areas, I promise you, you would notice it's a very grey society. So if you put these targets of these massive ambition to diffuse new technologies, you have to understand that this is going to be happening in an increasingly senior society. And will senior people be willing to engage in these new forms of technology? That's a question that I never hear people talk about. But I think it's very important because population decline has already begun. We would have dropped 7 million just in 5 years by the time the Olympics are there. And then also by year 2040, we would have lost about 25% of the population. So that really shows you how ambitious these targets are. And another thing is if we compare this to other countries, So California in the United States is very serious about fuel cell vehicle diffusion, and Germany is as well, and so is the EU as a whole. But increasingly, China, they've just jumped on the hydrogen bandwagon very recently, and I think they've unveiled a roadmap very recently. They're very keen to overtake Japan. So, but if you look at some of the figures that are on the table, for example, China for mobility for FCVs, they're looking at having about 50,000 of these vehicles on the road by 2025. We can assume that would be probably by domestic Chinese manufacturers. Whereas Japan is looking at, looking after their domestic manufacturers, they're going to have 4 times that amount. And then in the year 2030, they have close to 1 million. These are all government targets, industry targets. But China will overtake in Japan at that point with 1 million. But these by far exceed the targets on the table in Europe and in California. And fueling stations, Japan right now, they have 100 today. They're looking at 160 in a few years. And then 320 by 2025. That's also going to be much larger than other countries, with the exception of China in the future. So just a few little points about hydrogen in Japan. So this policy has been shaped jointly by government and industry. Japan has a long history of picking certain industries, for example, robotics, getting together with industry, making policy to help that industry together with government. That's what we're seeing happening here with hydrogen. And actually, it's the only country that has a coherent, national, and institutionalized vision and a set of policies for the hydrogen economy. And what I mean by that is basically this pursuit of a hydrogen society. All of these diffusion targets I've shared with you all are all present in these the new Basic Energy Plan, which was released last year. And this Basic Energy Plan basically is a very centralized energy policy making, as I described to you, sits at the top of the pyramid and sets the agenda for all government agencies and gives the message to all industries where they should be investing their funds for the future for energy. And so hydrogen and all these roadmap I've just explained to you is being integrated into all of these government documents. And there's a remarkably consistent vision and set of narratives about how we're going to get to a hydrogen society. And that's one of the really distinctive things about hydrogen in Japan. For an example, hydrogen is frequently touted or marketed as inevitable. We have no choice but to integrate hydrogen into our energy mix in the future. And the reason is because you'll hear stories like, which is it's very difficult to refute this, that EVs, electric vehicles, cannot meet all of our transport needs, especially for long distance heavy vehicles. And also batteries for like electricity storage. Of course, we're seeing larger and larger batteries, but to use batteries, for example, on the scale of, the time scale of like, days, weeks, months to store large amounts of energy, that's not possible right now. So another thing that's very, very important is in Japan, the starting point for a hydrogen society is not about renewables diffusion. The starting point is about diffusing hydrogen and related technologies, which is phase 1 in the roadmap, which I've just explained. Germany, for example, has a very different approach. Germany's starting point was diffusing renewables. And right now in Germany, they have huge fields where there's excess wind power. What do they do with that wind power? We have to store it, or we can just waste it. It's better to sort of use it, use it like in an economically significant matter. So that's when electrolysis, power to gas, taking that excess wind power, using electrolysis to produce hydrogen, and then feeding that into the natural gas grid and offsetting the inputs of natural gas. So it's a very different approach in Germany. They started off by pursuing renewables, having an excess of electricity. What do? Then we use hydrogen as a tool. Whereas Japan is the kind of more so the opposite. We want to get to a hydrogen society. How do we get there? Renewables is one way, but so is fossil fuels. That's a big difference. So a lot of people might be saying, okay, so hydrogen is being pursued in Japan. Why are other countries doing hydrogen? And for example, why isn't Japan pursuing decarbonization through renewables, like, for example, like Germany did in the early stages? So there are lots of reasons for this, but basically, Japan really, the utilities and the equipment manufacturers, they really lack competitiveness in renewables, no matter what sort of propaganda you might hear when you live over there. And that's why, for example, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries partnered up with Vestas, the overseas winds experts. That's what they have to do now to compete in the global renewable energy markets. And so Japan also has a very long history, starting back from the 1960s, 70s, in investing, public investments in R&D, in fuel cell development. And they've been the world leaders for several decades in terms of the scale of public investment, the sales of technology, and the patents. And there's also widespread awareness of export. especially supply chains, international supply chains for hydrogen. And also, most importantly, it's difficult to produce evidence for this claim, but I've heard this in many conversations with people all over Japan, is that the Honda, Nissan, and Toyota are very concerned about EV, the shift to EVs, because the problem with EVs, as you know, it's a game changer. We can have companies in the Silicon Valley, we can have companies in China producing EVs that are probably going to be even a better quality than our established incumbent car manufacturers. And what are these car manufacturers going to do? We have to protect them because, as we know, like all big industries, people's livelihoods, jobs depend on this. So the strategy in Japan has been to really look at hydrogen fuel cell vehicles as being a response to this rising EV market across the world. And actually, there are very few opponents to hydrogen in Japan. I'm going to make this point later on, but actually, these big fossil fuel companies, Iwatani G-Power, which has which does a lot of coal mining in Australia. Actually, these are companies, and so does there's another company here called Readiness. They also do coal mining in Australia. These are companies that are on board with the hydrogen transition because they see a low carbon business transition happening for them occurring in a centralized energy system. And so this suits the interests of a lot of the fossil fuel industry. So in Japan, when the Toyota Mirai was first released commercially in 2014, this was big news because it's the automobile nation, as you can understand. So this is the Economist, this is the Newton sort of popular science magazine. This is the Economist. It doesn't necessarily translate as the Economist in Western sort of sphere. But anyway, we got a hydrogen fueling station. We've got the arrival of the Hydrogen Society here. This is popular media. And this is aimed at the masses. This is not aimed at academics. It's out there. People in the news are talking about this. And you walk around the suburbs in Japan, you're going to find these Eni farms. These are coal generation fuel cell units on the side of buses. And so this is taking natural gas and reforming that and creating hydrogen, then putting that into a fuel cell. You have a byproduct of heat, which is used in the hot water. Then you have electricity that goes into the house. It's only a very small output. I think it's like 700 watts. Very small, 0.7 kilowatts. But these are there. You can see them. You can go for a walk around Tokyo. You can see actually a fueling station, a hydrogen fueling station, and you can actually see an FCV pull in there and fuel up with hydrogen. You can, I was actually doing research related to coal actually in Tokyo, went for an interview, and right in front of me, this fuel cell bus pulled up. And I ran like crazy to take this photo from my smartphone. And I was really excited because I've been on one of these before, but I'm excited for lots of reasons. One of the reasons is how expensive these buses. $1 million. I'm not sure how much a conventional bus costs today. I guess it would probably, even a good bus, surely would not be more than $200,000. I don't know, I'm sorry. But hydrogen fuel cell bus, $1 million. It's made by Toyota, made by one of the smaller companies. $1 million, it just sounds crazy. But when I had a conversation with a colleague, she said, Greg, when the fuel cell vehicles first came out, they were $1 million. It's remarkable that the prices have dropped down now to like 50,000 US. You can now buy a bus for $1 million. But anyway, Tokyo, the metropolitan government in Tokyo is aiming to buy 100 of these, so $100 million investment in public transport. And you can, if you want to ride one of these, amazing to ride them. Quiet, as you can imagine. And they use the same technology as the Mirai, the fuel cell vehicles. They just have more tanks on board and larger fuel stack. This is Fukushima. So I've been doing a little bit of work. You go to regional areas and looking at how hydrogen is becoming a silver bullet for regions in Japan that are in big trouble. And I guess you could take the equivalent of Latrobe Valley in Japan, which is Fukushima. And we know that there's just been a massive disaster there. They've lost their credibility, they've lost their sense of identity, their confidence regarding energy especially. And so they're out to reinvent themselves. And hydrogen comes along. And they were already getting serious about renewables. But then the national government kind of worked with them to integrate hydrogen. And so this is a town that's about, I think, 20 kilometers or so, maybe 30 kilometers away from the reactors. And that was originally an evacuation zone. So this was a ghost town like this for several years. And then they just reopened and allowed residents to come back and live here last fall, about 6 months ago. And there's a fuel cell vehicles there. Look at all these businessmen here. And everyone's coming to hear about hydrogen in this little town in Fukushima, which is actually going to build a 20 megawatt solar array and export that hydrogen, export that energy in the form of hydrogen to the Olympics. And it's going to be branded as Fukushima Sustainable Hydrogen. So this is showing also the level of interest in Japan. And another one is this. This is an annual forum by Iwatani, which is big leader in Japan. They're a gas company. And they are actually building, they're building fueling stations right now. And they've done a lot of research historically on hydrogen. And they have an annual forum, which I went to last year. I'm in this photo somewhere. There's 1,000 people in this room. Imagine that, like at least 5 times more people than in this room now. And they're basically all gentlemen. It's, you know, the business world in Japan's kind of male dominated. And people are there sort of hearing the industry and hearing the government talk about, you know, their vision of a hydrogen society. There's a huge level of interest regarding hydrogen. And how's this? If you go to the supermarkets or the, I guess, lots of convenience stores, you can actually buy a bottle of water. It's apparently spiked with hydrogen. And a lot of scientists get angry at this. They say, how can this be? I mean, the hydrogen will escape through the bottle, you open it, it's just going to leak into the atmosphere. This can't be true. But actually, this hydrogen is apparently, as we know, it's a very light atom. You know, it's very, very small. So it actually moves freely through the body. It moves through the cell membranes, it goes through the bones, through the blood, and it actually attacks free radicals, which is good news if you want to be young and healthy. And so it actually would, and we can drink it, or we can breathe it, or we can have a bath in this stuff. And this mechanism, the mechanism, not the bottle, but the mechanism has been proven in a Nature paper. So there is science behind this, but whether this works or not is another story. But it's actually linked to a health boom in Japan, the hydrogen. So fuel cell vehicles. So this is the Honda. There are 2 right now in the market. We have the Honda Clarity, which is this one, and we have the Toyota Mirai. And this is like the showroom kind of version, and then this is the real life version. And I'm not sure if some of you might recognize that face there. This was 2 weeks ago. I was driving this, and Dr. Palmer, who came to visit me, we hired this together from the local municipality. And it's a pleasure to drive. The acceleration was really remarkable, much better than an EV from my experience. So now regarding EVs and also regarding hybrid vehicles, there are lots of challenges to diffusing these. And you can start off by looking at the literature, which is what I did. And everyone talks about the infrastructure. For electric vehicles, we need to have charging stations everywhere. And for fueling and for fuel cell vehicles, we need to have hydrogen stations everywhere. So that's really, really important. But with the infrastructure, who invests in that? And if some companies invest and other companies don't invest, you're going to have free riders. How should that be negotiated? That's one set of challenges. The next challenge is the lack of scale and critical mass. Right now, only Toyota and Honda have released a vehicle. That's 2 models. If you're a consumer, you want to buy a car, you're going to have hundreds of vehicles to choose from. Why would you choose from only 2 vehicles? So that's a big problem of mass, or critical mass. We need to have more manufacturers getting involved here. And few manufacturers would hamper the scale of economics. Another thing is that electronic vehicles, EVs, hybrid vehicles, and also fuel cell vehicles, they're competing with the established internal combustion engines. So the idea is to give them an additional feature to give them an edge over the competition. And I'm just going to quickly, these are 3 well-known challenges in mobility diffusion. Just going to quickly showcase what Japan's doing to counter this. Whether or not it's working is another question. So first of all, the idea is that in Japan, they're going to reduce the risks for the infrastructure rollout, for the hydrogen fueling stations, by huge government subsidies. The government's basically going to pay whoever builds a hydrogen fueling station about half of the construction costs. The construction costs are about 5 times the price of a gasoline station. And then the idea is that the construction costs will be covered, but so would the operation costs, because right now, all of the 100 fueling stations across the country are basically running at a loss. That's one approach. And the other one is to share the risks across the industry. So I'm just going to show another slide. We have the vehicle manufacturers, Toyota, Nissan, and Honda, who are the car makers, partnering with the fossil fuel companies, which are the people that sell liquid hydrocarbons or gases. And they're the people that make the fueling stations. So we're getting a partnership occurring here. And what we're doing is having the car manufacturers paying these guys with the government subsidies to build and to operate their hydrogen fueling stations. So this is the way that risk sharing is burdened across, risk burdens and economic burdens are shared across industry. And the other thing is really, I want to draw your attention here, is that these guys really are part of the fossil fuel regime. These are very big names in oil companies, etc. The other approach is that we're also looking at concentrating our resources. So first of all, we have to get lots of fueling stations out there, but also Germany apparently made a mistake when they're trying to use compressed natural gas vehicles. They put these fueling stations everywhere, evenly all over the country. instead of concentrating them where we expect the users to be. So Japan's approach has been, yes, we need to get one in every single prefecture in the country, but really we want to concentrate on Tokyo, on Nagoya, because that's close to the Toyota factory. We have to make those guys happy, Osaka, and Fukuoka. So the idea is right now we've got about 40% of the fueling stations around Tokyo, which of course makes sense, that's where everyone's concentrated. But also in other regions, but for psychological reasons, the idea is to fill up every single white gap here on the map. Have a fueling station in every prefecture, whether or not someone's using it or not. That's one approach to rolling out infrastructure. And another approach is regarding the critical mass challenge. Like we need to have lots of people making these vehicles. So I'm not sure if you all heard about this, but Toyota actually opened up their patents and allowed anyone who enters into an agreement with them to use their fuel cell vehicle and hydrogen tank and fueling infrastructure patents royalty-free for 5 years. And the idea is to entice other car manufacturers to be able to save costs and to produce a fuel cell vehicle and bring it out into the market, and also help get more vehicles on the market, both domestically and internationally. And apparently this is just, they've just copied the approach of Tesla. Vehicles. This is another approach. And whether or not this has been successful remains to be seen, but everybody's waiting on Nissan to release their fuel cell vehicle, because they're actually, as you've seen here, are in part of these car manufacturers, even though they haven't released it, but we have to assume they will. So, now this brings us to another important point, which is the inferiority to these alternatives. And so a lot of people sort of frame this as the EV versus an FCV sort of debate. It's a big oversimplification, but it's useful to make the comparison. So first of all, if it's in green, that means the FCV, that means that particular vehicle is superior. So in terms of mileage, we know that FCVs are by far superior, but basically double to an EV. And in theory, it's easy to increase. We just have to add more tanks on board. We don't have to add more heavy batteries on board. And the government and industry have already set a target of getting vehicles with 1,000-kilometer range. It's like, why would you need that much? I don't know, but that will be important, especially for trucks, etc. When it comes to charging time, we know that EVs take a long time, even at turbo. FCVs is just the same as the gasoline, fueling up process. Yeah. And also our fuel costs. We know that right now, EVs, they have an all-you-can-charge plan in Japan that's only about $18 per month. Wherever you go, you can get this. So this is the big area where FCVs are actually inferior to EVs. This is a really important topic, running costs. Purchase costs, EVs are much cheaper, but actually FCVs are being privileged by the government with a much larger subsidy. And this allows them to catch up there. Home charging, that's not possible with an FCV. There's a big problem there. We have the fueling infrastructure. We have 30,000 chargers all across Japan right now, but we don't have that particular numbers for EVs. That's another big challenge, psychological challenge at least. And then just another thing is cold weather. So batteries, as you know, are very weak in cold weather, but FCV is actually there's no problem there. And also deterioration. Batteries, as we know, laptops, etc., lithium ion, they deteriorate very rapidly, whereas an FCV won't. So there's kind of strengths and trade-offs, but one thing that Japan's done is actually use this idea of emergency power, electricity. And this is ridiculous, actually. It costs about $10,000 to purchase this additional piece of equipment. But the idea is that if there was a blackout, which is frequently out in Japan because of earthquakes, you could, if the tank was full, an underlying full tank supply of storage, if the tank was full, you could power your home for a few days. If you had made an investment of $10,000 to back it up. So these are just, this is just the concluding kind of unresolved challenges for FCVs, what I see, which is a really key part of the hydrogen transition, is basically the lack of fueling stations and upfront costs is basically what everyone emphasizes. And everyone's concentrating on addressing these challenges, but actually there are other underemphasized challenges which include the running costs of EVs and also the inconveniences that would be posed even by having 160 fueling stations. So this brings me to the last part of the talk, and I know that I've hit time up, so I just have to quickly look over here and negotiate. Do you think it might be possible to get around 5 minutes? Really? Fantastic, thanks very much. So I think that this is probably where a lot of the interest in this room is, and I hope I'm not talking too fast for you. I'm getting a pretty dry throat here, but I'm just going to keep soldiering along. So international supply chains. So I think we might skip this because of time, but by the way, all of my slides, on the very last slide of my presentation, there's going to be a URL. And if you're interested in downloading these slides, you can. But please just wait just to the end. Everyone will have a chance to download the slides if you're interested. But basically in Japan, there's lots of experimentation occurring right now to produce hydrogen from renewables. And I'm just going to showcase very rapidly 3 examples. One is using sewage sludge. And there's already a big project in Fukushima that takes sewage sludge, it produces methane gas, biogas, then converts that to hydrogen. Another project does this from livestock. This is dairy country in Hokkaido in the north, and they take cow manure and cow urine, which is very smelly, and they make biogas, same process, create hydrogen. The other project, which I mentioned, which is in Fukushima, is using electrolysis to make hydrogen. Now, this is all kind of nice, but there's lots and lots of challenges to this. For example, it's just renewables, it's well known, it's very expensive in Japan. And these resources are very far from the cities, except for sewage, which is located in urban centers. And the production, everyone knows it's technically possible, but the thing is, the problem is that the demand for hydrogen today is low. So even though this is the ideal, in the future we want to have domestic renewable sources producing hydrogen, the idea is this is expensive. It just makes more sense, for example, just to use electricity as electricity, or to use methane gas from a biodigester as methane gas instead of converting it to hydrogen, especially when there's a low demand today. So it's technically possible, but not really economically possible. So Japan's approach is to build international supply chains in the midterm. And Australia's the topic of one of these. But I just want to point out to everyone that not only is Latrobe Valley the topic of much interest for Japan, actually Brunei, this little country off the edge of Malaysia, who also has these fossil fuel reserves, is actually the target of a very similar project. And actually they're looking at using a different carrier, so not liquefaction, but actually using organic hydride to transport hydrogen to Japan. And just like Latrobe Valley, they're also looking at creating a pilot project, beginning off with about 210 tons in 2020. And there's very different companies involved. We have Toyota Corporation, which is involved together with Mitsubishi Corporation and Mitsui Corporation. These are fossil fuel players, these 2 guys. And then it's very similar to over here. We've got some fossil fuel companies here involved in the Latrobe Valley project. But the Latrobe Valley project is, I'm just trying to put it in context for you all, that it's not the only fossil fuel supply chain under investigation right now. We have this Brunei one, and also at the same time, apparently Japan has just entered into an MOU with New Zealand because they have lots of geothermal and hydroelectricity resources that could be used to create carbon-free hydrogen. So there's just a little map here, which just shows you just the thinking that's actually going on right now. This is actually a slide I stole from Kawasaki Industries. But it just shows you that, of course, we're going to have a supply chain coming from Australia with brown coal-derived hydrogen, but also I'm sorry, it's hard to see the map, isn't it? So we've got New Zealand here, which is showing it's geothermal. I'm sorry, there's New Zealand just there. And then also, potentially like, Patagonia, windmills in Patagonia. Also, this must be Quebec, in Canada, hydro. So the idea is, as far as Kawasaki wants to see this, they want to see lots of international supply chains built because they build the ships to go with this. They can make lots of money by getting lots of these supply chains built. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but the idea in Victoria is to take the very cheap, accessible brown coal and to convert that to hydrogen via gasification, first of all, and then to put that on this specially purpose-built tanker, which would carry it in a liquefied state to Japan. And not only would that be used for these transport, the idea is to bring it into the power plant sector, as I keep explaining, because the power plant sector has the potential to create a huge demand for hydrogen and to lower the costs for the FCVs. The idea is to create a synergy here. And so I'm just going to skip this slide because of time, but basically it's been made very clear by project implementers that we could try and source hydrogen from renewable sources, even in Australia, for example. But many people argue that would, if you're going to compare cost, scale, and the stability of supply, coal would probably be superior. That's why there's so much interest around the Australian brown coal reserves in the Latrobe Valley. So Kawasaki Heavy Industries argued to achieve the same sort of level of output in the future, we have to be looking at creating a 3 gigawatt solar array. There are very few of these in the world, by the way. So a lot of people are skeptical of the carbon capture and storage, right? And a lot of people are thinking, so far there's no real projects in the world that use CCS for climate mitigation purposes. Why would we expect to see this happen in Latrobe Valley? People are worried that it's going to go ahead without CCS. And the pilot project will go ahead without CCS, based from my understanding. So if CCS is incorporated into Latrobe Valley, that would be when the project is commercialized, if it's commercialized, which there's no decision on that yet. But I want to make a point about this. First of all, is that the CCS costs, according to Kawasaki Heavy Industries, only make up about 10%, where is it? About 10% of the costs. They've got a target of trying to get about 30 yen per cubic meter of hydrogen. This is a 2030 kind of target. It's kind of a figure that's roughly compatible with natural gas. CCS, according to them, only takes up about 10% of the cost. Most of the cost is actually in liquefaction. And also in the coal gasification, the production. So that's one reason to expect why CCS wouldn't pose an economic barrier to the project. Another thing is that G-Power, who is a company that has big interest in the coal industry, in coal-fired power and also coal mines, they're very serious about demonstrating the success of this project because they don't really have a backup plan when it comes to decarbonizing, because so many Japanese manufacturers specialize in thermal electricity rather than renewables. So this really is an important project to these guys. And also, I keep explaining that the national policy has institutionalized hydrogen policy. And in these top-level documents, we see words such as Australia, brown coal, CCS, supply chains. This is in the top-level documents. So that's why we probably expect CCS not to be abandoned. And so, I mean, there's also a great Australian researcher who's working out Kyushu University, who's made a paper, a very detailed analysis of the cost considerations of the Latrobe Valley project and compared it, for example, for renewables. And he's also come to the conclusion that today, coal would be much cheaper in terms of, even with CCS, would be much cheaper for producing large amounts of hydrogen. But in the future, obviously, that's going to be challenged by a declining cost in renewables. So I went to the Latrobe Valley, just came back this morning, and had a few conversations down there. And I met with some residents. And so not everyone, obviously, in the Latrobe Valley is, super excited about this project because, the Latrobe Valley is an area that's been subject to environmental pollution for decades. It's because of the coal industry. And so we've got some residents down there that are sort of very concerned about the environmental impacts, even of a pilot project. And so their concerns basically, first of all, I haven't been able to verify if this is true or not, but their claim is that there hasn't been an environmental impact assessment on this project because it's a pilot project. And so they're also concerned about, for example, air pollution from the coal gasification and any waste that's left over in the process. Because still the raw ingredient is brown coal. And they're also concerned about if this project was commercialized in the future, well, that would invigorate the coal industry, the coal extraction, mining. And that would open the door, for example, other coal fires in the future. So that was another of their concerns. And they're arguing, do we accept jobs rare health? So I'm not saying that these arguments are scientifically founded, but this is the reaction of some part of the community, apparently. And so this is obviously representing probably some challenges to the, I guess, project organizers. And there's been claims that the community consultations haven't been sufficient so far. So closing remarks, last slide, I think I'm way overdue. I'm really sorry about this. 2 minutes, we're done. I've got to drive home as well. So I just want to, I know I didn't really make this point super clear in my talk, but a point I would like to add, if I may, is that personally speaking, I think that Japan's approach is it's high cost and it's high risk. And what I mean by that is basically, I'm comparing the approach, for example, to Germany, but to explain Japan's approach, it requires construction of expensive new infrastructure from scratch. It's infrastructure that does not exist today. Fueling stations, hydrogen fueling stations, international supply chains. This is not cheap. Some of the numbers are being thrown around the room today. A pilot project is going to involve $50 million from the state of Victoria, $50 million from the Commonwealth government, and then we have all this money coming from Japan. This is just a pilot project. This is expensive stuff. So, and a lot of the success on the future of these projects depends on the diffusion of fuel cell vehicles. Will fuel cell vehicles actually take off on the market? No one can answer that question. If I tell you they can answer it, they're lying. Nobody can. Because who can predict human spending, which is, consumer behavior, which is dictated, by many factors. And so Japan is betting that fuel cell vehicles will take off, that would justify the building of an international supply chain. It's a risky approach, but it has potential for very high reward, because if it's successful, no other country is going to specialize in these international supply chains. Japan will assemble all the technology, all the solutions for this. So that's a prospect of high reward. But and also we see that hydrogen production in the midterm and the short term is not linked to renewable energy diffusion. That's very, very different to, say, for example, Germany, and also France is becoming very interested in power to gas, because they've started off by a renewable energy diffusion sort of policy, and then now they've got to the point where they have lots of excess electricity. What do we do with this? We can use this to create hydrogen. So if hypothetically each country, Germany, France, and Japan were to fail, Japan would be left over with a whole bunch of unused fueling stations, an underexploited international supply chain, and a country like Germany and France will be left over with a whole bunch of wind turbines, which are very useful, aren't they? So there's a big sort of difference here in approaches. And then also the plummeting renewable costs, which we know are occurring every year, might challenge the logic of fossil fuel plus CCS supply chain, even though it makes a lot of sense today. But if that was the case, then it's just going to increase the logic of a renewable hydrogen export program, which is the next presenter will be briefly introducing to us. So they're my key points, and I guess some of you might be interested in learning more about this. So I just put up a few key documents there. I see a gentleman with your camera there. I recommend you take this slide instead. Just take the photo there, and then you can go onto the internet and download all of the slides. But if you can't be bothered doing that, I'll go back to this other slide, which is further reading. And there's a few government policy documents here. There's a paper I've just published recently. And then there's a paper by another Australian working at Kyushu University, which focuses on the economics of the Latrobe project. So it's been 45 minutes, so I'm well over time. It's been 50 minutes. I think I'm in big trouble. I guess they'll just kick me out and send me back to Japan. It's, but it's been absolute, yes, the last slide. So it's been an absolute pleasure having you been able to share this conversation. It's been very one way. I'm just going to quickly sit down, and because there'll be a two-way conversation, start up very quickly. So thank you very much for everyone's attention and for your time. I hope this was instructive for some of you.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, for the terrific overview of Japan's approach to hydrogen and energy policy. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of activity in Australia, quick 5-minute presentation. Really, last year was where everything really sort of came together in Australia with hydrogen. First of all, we had the Future Fuel CRC, which started, which 26 million funding. But a big report from ACIL Tasman about the potential hydrogen exports from Australia. Some of the numbers are really big. When we look at energy globally, potentially if hydrogen does take off and become a globally significant fuel, and Australia is part of that, we're talking sort of tens of billions of dollars in industry. But it's not going to be something that's going to happen quickly. We're looking really at things starting to ramp up sort of around 2030, and it's not until 2040 we see some really big numbers. And then the big report, well actually the National Hydrogen Roadmap from CSIRO was really the main report that came out that really drives the roadmap for Australia's hydrogen future. So this looks at both domestic and export use. There was a COAG briefing, the Finkel report, Hydrogen for Australia's Future, which sort of paralleled this, but it provided another overview. Then we had ARENA funding, $22 million in funding across Australia on a lot of projects, and that's really kick-starting a lot of activity. And so just looking at some of the current projects going on at the moment, the first thing to note is that there's a lot of projects, all states are involved. The second thing is I've overlaid these projects over a map of Australia showing solar resources and wind resources. So from a wind perspective, we have the roaring 40s coming across here, so we've got a lot of wind along here, and then the trade winds up there. So we already know there's a lot of wind resources. And of course, there's a lot of solar, even down in the southern part, there's plenty of sun. So if I start off in Western Australia, I'll just highlight a couple of these. For example, Yarra Renewable Ammonia. Yarra produces ammonia fertilisers. They're a Norwegian company. So they're looking at producing ammonia, which comes via hydrogen with renewable energy, and this is going to be a field project. There's a huge wind and solar project that's planned It's called the Asian Renewable Energy Hub. That only includes a fairly small component of hydrogen, but that includes a link to Asia. That's actually a high voltage link. We'll look at Woodside, are very interested in hydrogen. As Greg said, a lot of fossil fuel companies really see this as being potentially the future, and they're very interested in it. They're looking initially at natural gas, potentially with CCS, but I don't think there's any definite plans at this stage, and also renewable energy. Fortescue's also expressed an interest, so everyone wants to be involved. If we look at South Australia has probably been the state with the most activity. There's a lot of projects going on. In 2017, they released the South Australian roadmap for hydrogen. There's a lot of electrolysis projects, a bus trial, and so forth. Then we move closer to home in Melbourne. This university has an advanced engine lab that received ARENA funding. So this is actually combusting hydrogen in internal combustion engines. So this is an alternative to using diesel. It's not as efficient as fuel cells, but it's a lot cheaper, and the engines are basically they don't have to use high quality hydrogen. RMIT has a long-standing interest in hydrogen. There's a solar and hydrogen lab. They've also got an ammonia combustion lab, because ammonia is produced from hydrogen, so that's another potential process. And then I won't go through them all, but there's lots of activities. The ACT government's purchasing 20 Hyundai Nexos, which are a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. They haven't arrived yet, and they're going to be putting in a refueling station. So this is a map of primary energy sources in Australia. This also shows the wind and solar, and also everything else. There's natural gas off the northwest shelf. There's the brown coal in Victoria. We've got black coal. We've got unconventional gas. Key thing about this is that all of these energy resources can ultimately be used to produce hydrogen, either by thermo processes or via electrolysis. So once you can produce electricity from any of these and then produce hydrogen. And there's also there's potential synergies. For example, Australia has expertise and trading relationships with LNG, for example, and this would work quite nicely with hydrogen supply chains. So look, I just wanted to give you a quick overview, and these slides will be available afterwards. And I'll pass you over to Leo, who'll talk a little bit more about Latrobe Valley.
That's going to be something. Cool. It's easy. Good evening. I'm coming at this from a quite different perspective. My background is in higher education policy and innovation. And I'm not an energy expert at all. So what we're trying to do is actually assist Gippsland. So it's not merely the Latrobe Valley, it's Gippsland in trying to create an innovation system, essentially. It stemmed out of the Latrobe Valley Authority being established to assist with the transition after the closure of Hazelwood. It's getting a much broader profile now. And we're not simply working in energy, we're trying to work across food and fibre, which is still a very big sector in Gippsland, around energy, around health and well-being, and around the district economy. We're trying to look at the intersections there to see what can be distinct about the strength of Gippsland. And obviously, energy still is a strength in Gippsland, but it's not the only one. So we're trying to look at place-based innovation, driven by local industry, driven by local communities, not driven by consultants, not driven top-down by government. So it's actually trying to give a voice to the people in Gippsland to build on what they see as their strength into the global value chains. And so there's a lot of ambition there. There's a lot of support from Victorian government, from the Latrobe Valley Authority, from local governments, from the tertiary sector, and from community groups. So it's trying to get people together to create what essentially is a connected innovation system. Because the analysis so far, I mean, how many people here are from Gippsland or the Latrobe Valley? Very few. I mean, the analysis that is quite common there is that it is a fairly disconnected region. There's a lot of things going on, but it happens in isolation. And the idea really is trying to connect that up so that you can reap added value, that you can create the benefits of collaboration, and that you can share what actually might be a future vision. So this is really a ground-up process, not centrally planned, not with a clear vision of what the outcome will be. So it's fairly unstructured in that sense, but it uses a methodology that has been developed in Europe called smart specialization, which is a condition for any region in Europe to receive funding from the European community for regional development. They need to have a plan, a smart strategy, and a smart specialization strategy, sorry. And that's what we're trying to adapt to the local circumstances in Gippsland. So we're not transposing something out of Europe, bang, into Australia. That would be pretty useless. It really needs to be context-based, place-based. So there's a lot of trial and error involved in all of this, but we think that ultimately what we can get to is this. It's an idealized version of what Gippsland could be. It's an idealized version of what Victoria could do in terms of regional development. But we think if we get even partly into that situation, we will have achieved a great deal for people in Gippsland, for the industries in Gippsland, and for the strength of the Victorian economy and society. So I'll leave you with that. I'm sure we can have more on this in the discussion phase. So this is just emphasizing that we're much wider than merely energy, and energy itself, as we've seen, is already a hugely complex area. So this is a pretty complex project as well. But thanks for your attention.
Thank you all speakers. I take full responsibility for very time at the time. I was really enjoying your presentation, and I was very keen you should continue. I hope that hasn't inconvenienced anyone here. So we do, I think, even though we're running slightly late, we definitely want to have some time for questions. We have a couple of roving microphones, and we would ask that you use them because we're recording this, and it ensures that questions are picked up. We also have a number of people joining us via webinar, so please do send in questions if you'd like them to be raised as well. I think Lex has already chosen somebody. Thank you. Yes, that's a good idea. Could I ask that you say your name and if you represent any organisation, which one it is, and also just for ease, direct your question to the person you'd most like to answer it. We have three very different speakers here.
Yes, hello, my name is Santiago. I'm not representing anyone. My question is mainly about the Japanese production or need of hydrogen. I was wanting to know who's going to take mainly the responsibility of the emissions for the production of hydrogen, and if it's Australia, if it actually affects the target.
Sure. I guess, yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, the responsibility for the emissions for hydrogen. So right now, I guess this idea of having CO2-free hydrogen, that's kind of, you can call it like aspirational, because there's no like sort of legal obligation for this to be achieved. And so the idea is that even if that was hypothetically achieved tomorrow, and this hydrogen was then mixed into you know, the hydrogen grid, well, there's not going to be a grid, but you know, the distribution infrastructure in Japan would have that mixed with so-called, you know, like dirty hydrogen. So that's right now. I think there's about, I think it's 4,000 tons or 400 tons. I'm sorry, I forget which, of hydrogen is produced each year in Japan, and a lot of that, the majority of that is produced from natural gas, from steam reformation, which has a carbon footprint, as we know. And so hypothetically, clean CO2 free hydrogen was integrated into the mobility sector. It would be all mixed together. It's just like today with the electricity grid. We have renewables, and we also have a fossil fuel power plant supplying electricity to the grid. Unless there's some sort of policy instrument in place to allow a consumer to select the particular electrons that they use or the particular hydrogen they use, then we would have a very mixed up energy supply, which is the case in many countries. It's the case in Japan's context as well. So right now, there's no infrastructure, policy framework in place that would, for example, reward clean hydrogen on the market. This is a challenge for the future. And from what I understand in Europe, there's this idea about sort of labeling CO2. Just as you go to the gasoline petrol station, you can sort of see ethanol, right? And ethanol is kind of branded as being clean, and you pay more for that as a premium. So the idea is we probably have to do something like that in the future to allow consumers to be informed about the CO2 footprint of their particular energy or hydrogen that they're using, and then have the government reinforcing it, backing that up. I think that's what's required.
There's a gentleman in the front over on this side.
Hi, Lane Crockett from the Impact Investment Group. Look, I just sort of kind of wanted to follow on that question, but look at the pollution impacts of producing hydrogen in the Latrobe Valley from brown coal. So, firstly, can you tell us what the pollutants are that generally come from the process that you use, and then if you have any sense of what the health impacts would be for the local community?
Yeah, sure. So it's a great question that actually I was asking my colleague, Dr. Palmer, who's more of an expert on the technical aspects of hydrogen production. So I can just tell you that the residents, so I don't know the answer to that question. So there's several reasons for that. And one of them is that, as I said before, there hasn't been like a formalized environmental impact assessment which would address those concerns and communicate that to the community. And I guess the other reason is that this hasn't been explicitly dealt with either in Japan or in the region. So that information, from what I understand, is not really available. But I think we can make some assumptions. And one of the assumptions is because we are still burning coal. And so the hydrogen is actually not coming from the coal. It's coming from sort of the water content in the coal as well. The hydrogen, that coal is providing sort of the heat source and the energy input, and then a catalyst for a chemical reaction. And so you're going to have coal ash left over. And how harmful is that compared to, for example, the existing power plants that are in place? Because we know that coal ash is full of heavy metals, and it's a toxic substance that has to be treated as such. And what's going to happen there? I really don't have the details of that, and these are important questions that I'm going to do more research on this myself. But I think that probably the responsibles or the project implementers, I think that they probably, in many respects, have a responsibility to be transparent about this. I think this would only work to their advantage. Yeah, thanks.
There's a gentleman up the back on your side again. That's, in fact, we seem to have hundreds of questions on this side of the room. Sorry. And then.
This question for Greg again about the carbon dioxide associated. Because my understanding is that the production of hydrogen from coal is responsible for about as much CO2 as burning it, give or take. Obviously, you're talking about CCS, you had a nice little line in there under the Latrobe, which you said CCS, yes, it's got some boxes already ticked, and we know that in fact CCS doesn't exist in a sort of meaningful way right now. My name is Nick Gregory, I'm from Environment Victoria. We've spoken with members of the consortium behind the Latrobe project, who assured us that this would go ahead if it didn't have CCS.
Yeah.
You were talking just then quite happily about the idea of dirty hydrogen being part of a fuel mix.
Yeah.
Do you have a different perspective on what the Japanese government is accept in terms of emissions intensity higher in the fuels?
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's important to distinguish between the pilot stage of the project where you will not have CCS and the full commercial running stage where you will have CCS.
Yeah, not worried about the
Yeah.
pilot scale. I
Yeah.
understand some.
Okay, so your question's
about
on
commercial scale.
commercial scale. So can you just ask the question one more time, please? So I guess you want to know about sort of the degree of, I guess, what government responsibility regarding the achievement of that particular objective. Is that right?
I'm interested in your take on whether the Japanese government is indifferent or whether their consumption pattern can lead to excessive amounts of CO2 within Australia's emissions.
Yeah, so I can only make a comment, a response to that question, just I guess as an external observer, but I don't think that would be indifferent. I think that Japanese energy policy right now is not really exemplary around the world. It's nuclear has really destroyed the credibility of Japan, and also they also have this other problem about they are very pro-coal right now, as many of you probably know. They're building new coal-fired plants for electricity at home, and also building these across Asia, especially across the world. And so there's lots of criticism, especially from outside Japan regarding this. So Japanese government METI, who's behind this, the energy policy relevant to hydrogen, are very concerned about how Japanese policy looks from the outside. And so, as I said before, CCS, the integration of that, or the accomplishment of that during the fully functioning commercialization stage, that is basically institutionalized. So it would be very hard to imagine the pilot chain, the fully functioning, full-scale supply chain functioning without CCS. I don't think that would not suit the interest right now of, for example, J. Powell's involved, of Kawasaki Heavy Industries is involved, and it would definitely not suit the interest of the Japanese government, I don't think. So that's my personal sentiment. And I think, really, if this proceeds to full-scale commercialization, that would be in itself a huge accomplishment. I think technically it's possible, as everybody knows, but whether that can be achieved economically is anyone's guess. And I really like your comment about, right, you said the word, there's no meaningful CCS projects today in the world. That's a very interesting, I think, way of putting it, because I'll just use that as an opportunity to point out that most of the CCS projects in the world are attached to enhanced oil recovery. So always, like Norway is sort of used as an exemplary example of this. But right now, I'm not aware of any. There might be one, maybe it's in Canada, the Boundary Down project, where CCS is used for the purposes of reducing carbon emissions, for the purposes of mitigating climate change. I'm not aware of many examples of this. All of the CCS projects around the world, the commercially functioning ones, are there so they can extract more fossil fuels. So there's a lot of reasons for the project implementers, and also for Australia and also for Japan, to actually achieve a fully functioning supply chain that actually sequesters the carbon, the CO2 emissions, and does this in an economically viable manner. That would be probably a world first. That's like one of the biggest implications of this project. And whether or not that can be achieved is anybody's guess. That's a great question. Thanks.
Yes, the gentleman in the green. Yeah. Thanks.
Jerry Corpusano's Federation University. To Professor G, I'm interested in, you said it was bottom up, the smart specialization approach, but I know also that there are a lot of political interest, a lot of government interest, a lot of company interest in maintaining or trying to find answers to the Latrobe Valley, in particular the coal interest and so on. So when you say, bottom up, what role do the various large corporations and governments and their pseudo authorities that are in the Latrobe Valley play in developing the smart specialisation and maybe pushing CCS, for example, compared to the poor little community groups It's dispersed right through the Kids Lane, right across to out Bairnsdale and Renewables.
That's a very fair question. That's a good question as well. I mean, obviously, all this takes place in a political context. You can never ever ignore it. When I say bottom up, I mean there isn't a massive plan that has been devised either in Spring Street or in Morwell or whatever. There have been 50 or more plans for Gippsland. And I mean, we're very good at writing plans, we're very bad at implementing them. So we're trying to take that the other way around. And it's impossible to do that without taking into account political powers and industrial powers. And so you need to work with those parties. But it's about giving as many organizations a voice in what's going to happen in Gippsland, and in particular trying to work across sectors. And so when we talk about food and fiber, it would be ideal if we can find innovative projects, innovative areas where food and fiber is linked to new energy, where it's linked to the digital economy. And that brings both small and larger players into the play itself, which we think is a good thing. But it is, as you said, completely impossible to ignore the past of Gippsland. It's completely impossible to ignore the large industrial interests that are especially there from the large energy companies. Because when we look at food and fiber, that's far more a decentralized sector with only a few large players. And those large players do their own thing, as do some of the energy companies. But at the same time, there's a lot of potential there, both in combining interests of bigger players with smaller players, trying to get them around the table. And the mere idea of actually getting people around the table is challenging for some, but it's a great learning experience. So that's where things are at. And certainly in the energy field, we've only just started there because there was a very sensible political discussion. Don't start with energy. If we still have an election to come, it's not going to get you anywhere, which is again reflected on what you're saying. So yeah, we'll see.
Okay, I'm mindful of the time. We might take one more question from the floor and then pass to, there's nothing coming through on webinar. Okay, so we have three. So can I pass to the woman at the back? Because we've had a large number of men. We should make sure we have some women voices as well.
Hi, I'm Robin. I was just wondering about the Australian, if we have any plans in Australia for hydrogen gas production. Because I always thought maybe if we use our wide desert spaces for hydrogen production with solar, and perhaps have pipes of water to allow for that. But yeah, I was just wondering if you know anything about that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, there are very big plans to produce hydrogen via electrolysis from renewable energy. There's a lot of research projects being undertaken. Really, it's a matter of getting the costs down. There's also the logistical costs of dealing with the hydrogen once it's been produced. So, for example, it's better if it's produced close to the coast where you can ship it. It's much more costly, obviously, producing it far inland or producing it somewhere where there is a demand for it. So the cost of hydrogen from renewable energy is dependent upon the cost of renewable energy, the cost of electrolysis and how much you run it, or the capacity factor. And trying to get those numbers together and get a really good combination and get low cost hydrogen, really that's the challenge. So the direction of costs is pretty clear. Electrolyzers are coming down, but there isn't this scale economies just yet. But over the next decade or two, we're going to see orders of magnitude increase in fuel cells and electrolyzers. So we're going to see big reductions in cost. So it's really hard to know where things are headed at this stage.
Can I just add one brief little comment. I've got my mic on, it's great. But in my sort of travels in Japan, I've noticed that there's lots of interest right now regarding how we can produce hydrogen. And I just showcased a few interesting experiments. The one that involves biogas from cow waste, livestock waste. What did it say? The catchphrase is like, we don't just produce milk, it's also like hydrogen. But it's technically possible to produce hydrogen, as we know, in lots of different contexts, lots of different countries with lots of different inputs. But how do you use the hydrogen? Most of the people I've met in Japan are all wrestling with this question. And these government-sponsored pilot projects, they produce hydrogen really sustainably interesting ways. But now that they have it, what do they do with it? Because right now the problem is there's no demand. And so one of the really interesting areas for stimulating demand would be the electricity sector, because natural gas is burned in huge volumes. And that really drives down the prices of natural gas for residents and for people that want to use their vehicles, for example, compressed natural gas. So really, how do we create a demand for hydrogen? And I think probably instead of relying on people to change their behavior, we probably have to look at government instruments and policy to do this. And carbon taxes, all sorts of things. So there's no, I would just encourage you just to also think about utilization. That's probably, from what I've seen right now, today, it's the most difficult part of the transition, actually.
One more from the floor. Sorry, thank you. We don't have any coming through the webinar, so we'll have one more from the floor. Down the front.
Really any at the panel, but can you give us some quantitative idea of the emissions intensity of energy coming through this process? For example, if you ran a hydrogen fueled turbine to make electricity, what would be emissions, tons of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour, for example? Secondly, use some numbers on approximate cost differential between hydrogen from electrolysis, renewable energy, and from the chemical thermal route. And to be precise, at what price of electricity from renewable energy would the cost be equal to the cost from coal-based hydrogen?
Yeah, great questions, thanks. And I'm sorry to say that I don't have the answers to these questions. So regarding the second question about at what point is renewable energy, what sort of cost per kilowatt hour do we need to have hydrogen produced by electrolysis to be competitive? There's the Chapman paper that I introduced you to. There's some pretty detailed breakdowns from the context of Australia in there. So that's the first thing I'd say. And also regarding the cost of the CO2 footprint of bringing in hydrogen into the electricity generation sector where it's going to be burnt. Yeah, there's, I don't know the answer to that either, but there's several things that have to be done. One of them is we're probably not going to have 1 gigawatt gas-fired power plants running just in hydrogen. That's one of my conversations with Kawasaki Heavy Industries. They're looking more at creating sort of modular generators or turbines that will be located, for example, closer to the city, the areas of demand. And the idea is that these will come on and offline very rapidly. And the idea is that we'll be looking sort of around 300 megawatts. And the idea is that they'll be linked up to cogeneration. So that's the important thing. So that excess heat has to be used, and that has to be, and district heating is not really, it's not really part of the Japanese urban sort of fabric. And so the CO2 emissions of that, obviously, I mean, superficially, it's supposed to be zero if the CO2 is being captured at the point of production. But regarding, but obviously, there's also energy trade-offs along the whole chain, because we also have liquefaction, which consumes large amounts of energy, gradual extraction of the coal. So this all calls into question life cycle analysis of different assumptions that are made, and where do you draw your boundaries in that? And I'm really sorry that I don't have the answers to these questions. But what I have seen, I didn't include this in my references, but Kawasaki Heavy Industries has a life cycle analysis of hydrogen that's injected into a tank. So what is it? It's well to wheel, and the carbon footprint, the carbon emissions footprint, and the Gippsland project comes up roughly on par with like so it's actually there is an emissions of CO2, and it comes up very well like on par with wind. So it's not completely CO2 free if we take into account the extraction, but they're confident in that, and that's why they produced the data via a third party and published that. So if you email me, I can send you the table and everything. Yeah. I'm sorry I couldn't answer the question.
Yeah, I can just
Yeah,
a couple of costs out there. Yeah, steam methane reforming and coal gasification runs at about $2, $3 a kilo of hydrogen. So the CSIRO report modelled a number of different scenarios with renewable energy, looking at 6 cents a kilowatt hour, sort of looking at sort of $8 to $12 roughly. So it depends on the capacity factor and the cost of the electrolysis. Conceivably, if electrolysis was co-located with a solar PV plant, for example, I mean, we could be looking at sort of, I don't know, 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour for the electricity. But then it wouldn't get the capacity factor to amortise the cost of the electrolysis. So it's a matter of trying to get those numbers right and get the cost of electrolyzers down. There's also the issue of network costs. For example, you could do a PPA with renewable energy and locate the electrolysis where it was, it lowered the cost of hydrogen logistics, but then you'd have to add network costs, and that increases the cost. So you could possibly look at co-locating different types of renewable energy to get the capacity factor up, so that's another strategy. So this is really work for the future, trying to balance those things to try to get the costs down. So it does need to come down quite a bit to get the renewable energy electrolysis competitive with fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you all. It's been fantastic to see so much interest in this topic. I really do thank you all for coming out this evening. I'd like to thank our sponsor again, the Victorian Clean Tech Fund, and of course I'd like to thank our speakers. And Walter has something to say before or after we thank our speakers.
Thank you. Just one more event announcement. Thanks to our collaboration with Renew, we have on the Wednesday, 20th of February, that's next week, at 6:45, here in this theatre, carry shot for the Energy Security Board. And it will be a fantastic event, so together with the HASP, the Climate College, and the Sustainable Living Festival. So next Wednesday, look at our website here, we have the event announcement there, you can register either for here or the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers. It's been a great evening. I've learned a lot myself.